Pedro was still holding the baby bottle when he heard the zipper of the backpack slam shut. Anna's face was cold, her eyes hard as stone. She walked past him without looking at their son, without a kiss, not even a goodbye. "I wasn't born to live in the mud with someone poor like you," she said. The door slammed behind her. The baby, startled, began to cry. And so did Pedro. Little Lucas was only 8 months old. He couldn't walk yet, but he already felt the absence. Pedro stood still, holding his son in his arms, staring at the trembling door. The neighbors heard the crying, but no one dared to come close. It was a cold morning. The stove wouldn't light. It felt like everything had been ripped away at once. His wife, his dignity, his hope. He tried to warm the milk using a candle. His hands were shaking. The baby sobbed on a thin mattress, and Pedro sat beside him not knowing what to do. He whispered through tears, "We'll figure it out, my boy. I promise I'll take care of you." The sound of that promise was swallowed by the wind creeping through the cracks of the broken window. In the days that followed, Pedro went out with Lucas tied to his back, using an old towel like a sling. He built a makeshift wooden cart and started asking for odd jobs at local grocery stores and street markets. He carried bags, pushed shopping carts, and offered deliveries on foot. Whenever someone complained about the baby crying, he just lowered his head. "Sorry, he's my son. He's got no one but me." Some days they only ate white rice with flour. Some nights they slept on the floor because the mattress was soaked from the rain dripping through the roof. Pedro used his own body as a blanket for Lucas. The boy cried from the cold, and the father cried with him, clenching his teeth not to scream in pain. Mrs. Cedar, a widowed neighbor, was the first to offer help. She saw Pedro with sunburnt skin, dirt-stained clothes, and the baby burning up with fever. She brought them inside, bathed Lucas, and served Pedro a hot plate of beans. "A real man isn't the one who pampers a woman with luxury," she said. "It's the one who stands tall when everyone else walks away." But the humiliation didn't stop. One man spat on the ground and said, "That's what you get for chasing after a pretty face. Deal with it, loser." Pedro swallowed hard. He never answered back. He kept everything in his heart and turned it into strength to keep going. The baby was his anchor, his lighthouse, his only reason. One afternoon, Lucas got sick. High fever, weak breathing. Pedro ran to the clinic with the baby in his arms, shouting for help. He waited 5 hours on a cold cement bench. When the doctor finally saw them, he said, "You waited too long. You almost lost him." Pedro broke down in the hallway crying loudly, begging his son for forgiveness for not being able to do better. That night, back in the shack, Pedro sat with Lucas asleep in his arms. Moonlight spilled through the window and lit up the baby's face. Pedro whispered, "I'm going to change our lives, even if it kills me. You'll never know what it's like to lack love, my son, even if I have to work until the last drop of strength leaves my body." And right there, on that cold cement floor, a promise was born, one that not even abandonment could break. Pedro would wake before the rooster crowed, while the sky was still dark. The early morning cold cut through his skin, but he was already up, wrapping Lucas in a torn blanket that smelled of soap and sweat. He placed the boy in the makeshift cart made from old wooden crates and pushed it downhill in search of work before sunrise. The city was still asleep, but Pedro's battle had already begun. At the traffic light on the main avenue, Pedro stood still, offering help to drivers, wiping windshields with an old rag. Some laughed, others cursed. One woman once shouted, "Get that baby off the street, you irresponsible man." Pedro just looked down at the sleeping boy on his chest and, with eyes full of tears, softly replied, "If I had a choice, ma'am, he'd be in a crib and I'd be at a job." But choices were a luxury Pedro had never known. Some days, he came home with just a couple dollars in his pocket. He'd buy a box of pasta and share it with Mrs. Cedar, who always left a bottle of herbal tea and a piece of bread by his door. Lucas was starting to babble his first words. "Dada, Dada," and Pedro would smile, even on an empty stomach. That tiny voice kept him going. One evening, Pedro tripped while pushing the cart over a broken sidewalk. He scraped his knee and split his palm open, but the cart didn't tip. Lucas was safe. He had fallen, shielding his son with his body. A man passing by mocked him. "You're not even good at being homeless." Pedro pretended not to hear. He wiped the blood with his shirt sleeve and kept moving. At night, he told Lucas bedtime stories of his own invention. There were no books, so he made up tales about a brave little boy and a warrior father who fought monsters made of concrete and puddles full of rain. Lucas giggled softly. Pedro always ended with the same line. "Love wins, little guy. Love always wins." One night they ran out of diapers. Pedro used an old t-shirt and spent the entire night hand-washing the sheets. He fell asleep sitting up, his feet in the wash basin, hands wrinkled from soap. The next day, a young woman who had seen them left a bag with cloth diapers, used toys, and a note. "You're the kind of dad every kid dreams of." Time passed, and Lucas started walking, stumbling over the dirt floor. And Pedro laughed, even while exhausted. The first time the boy called him Daddy clearly, Pedro cried so hard it scared the child. "It's just, I never thought anyone would ever call me that, son. I never thought anyone would love me that much." Their clothes came from donations. Shoes were always 2 sizes too big, but Pedro made sure everything was clean. He washed them in a plastic tub, hung them on a wire, and ironed them with the lid of a hot pan. "We might not have luxury, my son, but we'll have dignity, and no one steps on people with dignity." In the quiet of the night, Pedro would watch his son sleep and wonder where Anna was. If she ever thought of the baby. If she remembered those tiny hands she left behind. But then he'd shake his head and say to himself, "She left, but I stayed. And that's enough. That has to be enough." And it was. Because every single day, even through the tears, Pedro chose to love. To love with everything he had, even if it was almost nothing. Pedro could recognize the sound of bus tires before they even turned the corner. He had learned to spot the driver who let him ride for free, especially on rainy days when he had to cross the city with Lucas wrapped in a makeshift raincoat made of plastic bags. In the back seat, while the baby slept against his chest, Pedro dozed off for a few minutes, always with one eye open, afraid someone might try to touch his son. At a cargo terminal, he landed a job unloading trucks. The supervisor warned him, "Not with a kid. It's too dangerous." Pedro dropped to his knees, holding Lucas close, and pleaded, "I'll do anything. Just give me a chance." The man, moved by pity, agreed. And Pedro carried more than anyone else that day, even with aching arms, even with the baby strapped to his back like a shield. That's where he met Mr. Anselmo, a retired farmer who sold fruit at the street market. He saw Pedro helping out without a single complaint and offered him a piece of abandoned land on the edge of town. "You want to grow something? I won't charge a dime. I just want to see that land come alive again." Pedro didn't know a thing about farming, but he knew how to fight. He spent his mornings doing heavy labor, his afternoons digging with a borrowed hoe, and his nights rocking Lucas, who was almost 3. He planted lettuce, kale, tomatoes. The soil was dry and stubborn, but Pedro treated it like a second child. He talked to the seedlings, watered them with care. Lucas helped too, getting his hands dirty and laughing when the first green sprouts began to show. At the farmer's market, Pedro started selling his own vegetables, small, misshapen but grown with love. Neighbors bought them out of respect. Mrs. Tida built him a stall out of tarp scraps and old crates. "This man's got more dignity than half the men in suits," she'd say. Pedro only smiled, not with pride but with quiet gratitude. He knew it wasn't much yet, but it was a beginning. There were still hard days. On Christmas Eve, while the other homes lit up in celebration, Pedro and Lucas watched through their window. No lights, no feast. They shared a single fried snack and a small bottle of soda. Lucas said, "This is good enough, Daddy." Pedro cried in silence, vowing that one day things would change. One day he'd give his son the most beautiful Christmas dinner the town had ever seen. Lucas still wore hand-me-down clothes, but Pedro made sure he was always clean, well-groomed, and had his backpack ready for school. He walked him there on foot every morning, rain or shine, exhausted or not. The school principal teared up when she found out he walked over 3 miles each way just to make sure his son got an education. One morning, a local reporter covered the market and was drawn to Pedro and his humble stand. "Do you always bring your son with you?" she asked. Pedro answered firmly, "Always, because everything I am today is because of him." The piece didn't get much attention at the time, but it planted a spark that years later would set the whole country on fire with his story. On the way home, Pedro looked down at Lucas sleeping in the cart, using a bunch of kale as a pillow. He stopped, looked up at the sky and whispered, "God, I don't ask for much, just don't ever let him doubt how deeply he's loved." And the sky, in its silence, seemed to reply, "Keep going." Pedro woke up before sunrise, not out of obligation but out of love. He liked watching Lucas's face while he still slept, his long lashes resting, tiny fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. That simple moment gave meaning to everything. Pedro brewed coffee over a small camping stove, toasted bread on an old grill, and made sure the scent filled the air before his son opened his eyes, as if to say, "Today's already a good day, because we're together." At school, Lucas stood out. He was curious, kind, respectful. One day, the teacher called just to say, "Your son is different, he has something special, and I know it's because of you." Pedro cried quietly after hanging up. He kept that compliment in his heart like a trophy. The garden was growing slowly but strong. The vegetables looked healthier, and customers began to compliment the produce. Pedro learned to use kitchen scraps for compost, how to deal with pests, and when to plant based on the lunar calendar. He started attending meetings with a small farmers' association, always the quietest, always the one who listened most. But when he spoke, people paid attention. Lucas was part of it all. He helped with harvesting, wiped leaves clean with old rags, and made little drawings with the names of the vegetables to decorate their stall. One day he wrote, "My hero's garden." Pedro kept that piece of paper like it was cash. It was worth more than any sale. Even with little, Pedro made sure to teach what was right. One day Lucas found a wallet on the way to school. It had 70 reais and an ID card. Pedro took it immediately and walked miles to return it to the owner. "Honesty is what will set you apart in this world, son," he said. The man thanked him with a box of groceries, enough to get them through the month. For Lucas's 6th birthday, Pedro bought a small cake, saving up for weeks. He threw a party just for the two of them, balloons made from plastic bags, music playing from an old radio. When Pedro sang happy birthday, he was trembling. He had never seen his son so happy. And in that moment he knew every sacrifice had been worth it. But the trials weren't over. The city threatened to tear down the shacks in their neighborhood. Pedro sprang into action, collecting signatures, speaking to city council members. For the first time, he stood as a leader. He fought with dignity, with firm words and his head held high. And he earned respect. The demolition was suspended. One Sunday, Pedro took Lucas to the park. They sat on a bench with juice and 2 pieces of bread. Lucas pointed to a fancy car and asked, "Do you think we'll have one of those someday?" Pedro smiled. "I don't know, son. But if we ever do, it'll be because we built it brick by brick. And if we don't, that's okay too. Because I already have everything I need. You." And in that simple park, wearing second-hand clothes, with dirt still on their hands, Pedro didn't know it yet. But he was already rich. Truly rich. The kind of wealth no abandonment could ever destroy. The earth finally started to answer back. The kale plant stood tall, roots firm, and the fresh scent of harvest filled Pedro's humble home. His tarp-covered market stand could no longer keep up. People from other neighborhoods came to buy, drawn by the buzz surrounding the warrior dad's garden. Lucas, now 7, proudly packed the vegetables himself and handed them over with a smile. Pedro saved every penny. He didn't spend on anything unnecessary. He repaired the house with his own hands, replaced the roof, built an extra wall, and crafted a small bedroom for his son using wood scraps he found in the trash. You deserve your own space, son, a place to dream. And Lucas dreamed of becoming someone, of making a difference. What Pedro didn't know was that a bigger dream was starting to take shape. The school principal called him in. She said Lucas had been invited to compete in a statewide math competition. The odds were slim, but Pedro had only one thought. How am I going to get him there? He sold part of the harvest for cheap hitched rides along the highway, and they made the trip with 3 bus transfers, a cold-packed lunch, and a suitcase full of borrowed clothes. When Lucas won 3rd place, Pedro wept in front of the entire auditorium. The boy raised his trophy and shouted, "This is for us, Daddy." Everyone applauded. Some cried. A father with soil under his nails and tears on his face, holding his son like he was holding the whole world. That moment made the local news. A photo of Pedro and Lucas hugging was printed on the city paper's front page. Single father triumphs with his son. A story of love and resilience. The article reached a local entrepreneur, owner of a regional chain of produce markets. He found Pedro and said, "Your work matters. I want to help you grow." Pedro was stunned. The offer was simple. Use a neglected plot of land to build a model garden, which would later supply the store chain. There'd be a contract and everything. "But you've got to teach other dads too," said the businessman. "We want your fight to become an example." And Pedro agreed, afraid, but full of faith. That's how his first social project was born. He taught other abandoned fathers, homeless men and former inmates. He used the same soil, the same simple techniques. Lucas made the posters and helped with the videos. He started a YouTube channel called Growing Love with My Dad, and the internet began to take notice. Pedro still lived with only the essentials, but now there was dignity, there was purpose. The old tarp home had been replaced by a modest brick house. He bought his first brand new stove and cried the first time he lit the oven. "We won again, son." Sometimes at night, Lucas would ask, "Dad, do you think she ever thinks about us?" Pedro would stay quiet for a while, then answer, "It doesn't matter anymore, son. The love that stayed is stronger than the love that left." And in that simple house, lit by a single bulb, father and son slept in peace, because they knew the storm might have taken everything, except what truly mattered. Pedro was now known as Mr. Pedro around town. The poor boy who once sold kale at the farmer's market had become a symbol of strength. The garden had expanded. It now had a greenhouse, a basic irrigation system, and a small shed built with donated roofing. There, Pedro taught other men who had been forgotten, men like he once was. Each new sprout was living proof that pain can bloom into something beautiful. Lucas watched everything. At 8 years old, he spoke like a grown-up and thought like one too. He filmed his father's teachings, edited the videos on an old phone, and uploaded them to their channel. "It's not just about planting, Dad. We're teaching the world to love with their hands." Pedro smiled, not fully understanding, but trusting his son more than he trusted himself. The channel began to gain followers. Small numbers at first, but the comments came from everywhere. "I cried watching you two. This dad is a hero. This boy is a blessing." Views grew slowly, just like the garden, but they grew. Pedro, still a stranger to the internet, replied to each one with the same quiet humility. Then came the video that changed everything. Lucas recorded himself talking about how his dad raised him alone, how he fought, how he turned abandonment into kindness. The video went viral, over 1 million views in 2 days. By the 5th day, a national TV station called. They wanted a live interview, father and son on primetime television. Pedro thought it was a prank. He laughed and hung up. They called again. It was real. He nearly said no. "I don't know how to talk fancy. I don't know any of that stuff." But Lucas hugged him and said, "Dad, This story isn't about knowing, it's about feeling, and you teach the world just by looking at it. The whole town stopped to watch, Pedro and Lucas sitting in the studio holding hands. They told everything about the abandonment, the hunger, the garden, and the power of love. The host cried. The audience gave them a standing ovation, and when Pedro, voice trembling, said, "I didn't know how to farm or raise a child, but I knew how to love, and that saved me," an entire country held its breath. The next day, the town was swarmed. Reporters, fans, entrepreneurs, people wanting to donate, to help, to invest. Pedro kept his feet on the ground. He bought a larger plot of land outside the city. There, he began building a teaching farm, the Love Seed Farm. It offered shelter, training, dignity. It was an extension of his heart. Lucas, now the face of the project online, continued to shine. He was bright, kind, and grounded. Pedro looked at him and saw everything he had built, from his own tears. "You're my harvest, son, and the most beautiful harvest is always the one planted through pain." On the porch of their new home, overlooking the green fields, Pedro sat each evening with a cup of coffee and his son by his side. There was still no luxury, but there was peace. There was love, and a future glowing on the horizon. And in that moment of calm silence, their story was about to come full circle, though Pedro didn't know it yet, because the woman who left him, who had no idea what he had become, was about to see them, in front of all of Brazil, and she was not ready for what she would see. Anna was slumped on the couch, holding a glass of cheap wine in one hand and the TV remote in the other. Her hair was messy, her face worn out, her expression bitter, the look of someone who collected too many wrong choices. She had been through 3 failed relationships. Stability never returned. She moved from city to city like changing clothes, always running from herself. She flipped through channels, bored, until she stopped on a live program. A father and son were talking about resilience. The camera focused on the man, sunken eyes, calloused hands, a gentle voice. The boy beside him smiled with pride. "That's my hero." And then she froze. "Pedro?" she whispered, the wine glass slipping from her hand and crashing onto the carpet. Her eyes didn't blink. The host's voice echoed. Pedro raised his son alone, with dignity, starting with a small garden that became a full farm. Today, he helps hundreds of families across the country. Anna covered her mouth. Her heart pounded. It was him. It was the baby she had left behind, now a confident young man with his father's eyes. She sat there, paralyzed. She watched the entire interview. Tears started falling when she heard Pedro say, "I never spoke badly of his mother. I just chose to show him that absence can never defeat love." It hit her like a punch to the chest. The guilt she had buried for years exploded. The next few days became an obsession. She found the project's YouTube channel, watched every single video. She cried in silence, remembering the day she zipped up her backpack and turned her back on her child. She tried reaching out, sent messages, emails, DMs. "I was wrong. I want to apologize. I want to see you both." But there was never a reply. She went to the city, asked around for Pedro. They told her he now owned the largest farm in the region, a living school, a green empire born from pain. She took a bus there. Outside the gate, she stared at the big house, the organized garden, the uniformed staff, the trucks leaving full of produce. Was this real? A boy on a bike passed by and said, "Looking for Mr. Pedro. He's over there with his son, giving an interview to some foreign TV crew." Anna couldn't answer. Her legs gave out. She leaned against the wall. From a distance, she saw Pedro smiling under his hat, pointing to Lucas like he was saying, "This is my greatest treasure." She tried to enter. A staff member stopped her. "Sorry, ma'am, you need an appointment to come in." Anna begged, explained who she was. The woman hesitated, then went to Pedro and explained. He looked from afar. Their eyes met. For a few seconds that felt eternal. But Pedro didn't move. He simply shook his head, firmly, and turned back to speak with his son. The staff member returned and said, "He thanks you for coming, but asks that you respect the silence. He chooses to live with those who stayed." Anna fell to her knees. The crying came from deep within. There, at the doorstep she had closed years ago, she realized she was no longer part of that story. The story had moved on, and it had become beautiful without her. And what hurt the most was knowing that the love she abandoned didn't just survive. It flourished, without ever needing her. After the silent encounter with Anna, Pedro said nothing. He returned home, pulled off his mud-covered boots, and sat on the porch with Lucas. His son could tell something had happened, but didn't ask. He simply sat beside his father, just like he'd done since he was a boy, and waited. Pedro finally said, "Some things we overcome in silence, and that silence was my victory cry." But the universe didn't stay silent. A worker on the farm had recorded the distant reunion. The video, Pedro facing the woman who once abandoned him, without anger, without drama, just with quiet dignity, went viral. The caption read, "The man who conquered abandonment with love." And the whole country shared it. The invitations poured in, TV shows, international newspapers, universities. Everyone wanted to understand who this simple man was, a man who had become a symbol of resilience. Pedro kept his routine. He only accepted interviews where Lucas could come too. If he's not going, I'm not going, because this story belongs to both of us. He was honored by the city council, received medals, certificates, donations, but the biggest achievement was still ahead. A major national bank reached out. They wanted to turn the Love Seed Farm into a nationwide model for social rehabilitation, full funding, infrastructure, staff, transport. For the first time, Pedro signed a contract in a brand new suit. It wasn't vanity. It was respect. The same man who once cleaned car windows with a baby on his back was now shaping the future of hundreds of families. The farm expanded. It gained a school, a medical clinic, housing. A foundation was created named after his son, Lucas Institute of Love and Hope. He bought his first pickup truck, a silver Hilux with the license plate Philhote 1. He wore his success with elegance. It wasn't about showing off. It was about remembering where he came from and being grateful. Their new home, with a large porch, library, outdoor kitchen, and a modest trophy room, became a local landmark. Everyone wanted to meet the strongest father in Brazil. Lucas grew in wisdom and humility. At just 13, he was already giving talks alongside his father, telling people how real love never abandons, and how a man's faith can grow roots in even the driest soil. The world listened, and the world cried. And Anna? She kept trying to reach them. She sent letters, messages, voice notes full of trembling regret. She begged to see her son. Pedro never blocked her. He simply said, "If he wants to go, he will, but I'll never force anyone to love what was once absence." Lucas chose not to go. He looked at his father, eyes filled with emotion, and said, "She left. You stayed. And I only stay with the ones who stayed." And in that moment, Pedro understood. The greatest wealth he had didn't live in a bank account. It lived in the heart of a boy who had been raised with everything money could never buy. Pedro's name was now known far beyond the borders of his hometown. Magazines featured him on their covers with titles like "From Abandonment to Leadership, the Man Who Cultivated Love." But Pedro remained the same. He still woke up early, walked through the farm beds, and greeted every employee with a firm handshake and a sincere look. Wealth never went to his head, because his greatest treasure still slept in the room next door. Lucas was now 15, tall, smart, and respected. His eyes lit up when he spoke about the life they built. He created an online urban farming course that reached over 500,000 students. Each lesson began with the same line. My father taught me that you don't harvest without planting, and what he planted was love, even when he had nothing. Their speaking engagements became major events. Father and son stood on glowing stages facing thousands of tearful people. Pedro's story struck a deep chord, especially with those who had once felt abandoned. He never used a teleprompter, he spoke from the soul. I was left with a baby in my arms and the certainty that the world was cruel. But I learned that love doesn't need luxury. Love just needs presence. Anna watched everything from afar. She tried to attend one of the talks, stood at the back, hidden in the crowd. She cried the entire time, tried to approach him afterward, but Pedro, as always, exited through the side. He avoided too many spotlights. He preferred the dirt road that led into the fields. That's where he thought. That's where he felt. A journalist once asked, "Pedro, don't you even want to hear her side of the story?" He answered calmly, "Her love was a choice. Her absence too. I just learned not to chase those who turned their backs. I choose to run toward those who stayed." He bought more land. Now 300 hectares. 3 trucks, a tractor, refrigerated warehouses, all employees with full benefits. They built an entire village to house homeless families. And Pedro still lived in the same simple room, with a hammock on the porch and the same wooden table where he once fed Lucas rice and flour. At a formal gala honoring his work, Pedro was given a Lifetime Achievement Award. Thousands stood to applaud. He walked onto the stage in his usual cotton shirt, his son beside him, and simply said, "If I got here, it's because I held on tight to a little hand and promised never to let go. And I kept that promise." Anna watched on TV, just like the first time. She cried, choked, and screamed into the silence of her empty home. She tried calling. Pedro answered. Her voice trembled. "Do you hate me?" He replied gently, "No, Anna. I just don't love you anymore. And what isn't love, I've left behind." And with that he hung up. No anger, no drama. Because those who are whole don't need revenge and they simply move on. And Pedro moved forward, a giant. The farm had become a national symbol. News outlets called it the miracle of the forgotten man. Public school children visited on field trips. Seasoned farmers came to learn new techniques from Pedro. It was common to hear things like, "If that man made it, maybe I can too." Because Pedro's story wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been left behind. Lucas, now 17, was preparing to study abroad on a full scholarship, Harvard, social agronomy. Pedro hesitated at first. "You're everything I have." But Lucas answered, "And you taught me to become everything, so I could go even farther." Pedro cried, but he let him go. Because real love doesn't hold tight, it lets go. On the day of his departure, Lucas looked at his father and said, "If you were a seed, Dad, you'd be the kind that survives the worst drought and still finds a way to bloom." And he left. Pedro stayed on the porch, heart aching but bursting with pride. "Go, my son, take this love to the world." Anna grew old alone. She never rebuilt her life. She lived on memories and regrets. She kept newspaper clippings, saved videos, screenshots of every appearance Pedro made. The last time she tried to reach out, she wrote a long letter, full of apologies, admitting that time had taught her what she once refused to learn. Pedro read it, folded it carefully, placed it inside a wooden box, alongside Lucas's first diaper, the first leaf from the garden, and a photo of the wooden cart he used to carry his son. He never replied. Because some answers are given in silence and in success. At the farm, Pedro inaugurated a new school named after the only woman who had ever taken him in without asking anything in return. Dona Cida, Center for New Beginnings. It was a tribute to the woman who helped him when no one else would. There, they taught faith, courage, and forgiveness, but never how to go back. One evening, sitting alone under the open sky, Pedro looked up at the stars and whispered, "I lost a wife, but I gained a world. I was left with nothing, and now I give everything." A worker approached and said, "Mr. Pedro, people are asking, what's your secret?" He smiled, still gazing at the sky, and answered, "Love until it hurts, and keep loving anyway." And so, with muddy boots, a light soul, and a heart full of deep roots, Pedro kept moving forward, never looking back, because the future was already his.